Зараз будемо говорити на тему.
We're going to speak about Latvia supports Ukraine on reforms. Ojārs, Ēriks, Kalniņš, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And the briefing is in English. If you need a device for simultaneous interpretation, you can get it in our hall. So please take the floor.
Well, good morning, and I'm here on behalf of the Latvian Foreign Affairs Committee with two of our members, and I would say that initially the purpose of our visit is to once more reiterate Latvia's support for Ukraine and the support of the Latvian people to the people of Ukraine. I was last in Kyiv last year on February 20th of 2014 on a very historic day, and I am very glad to see that a lot has changed in the city since that very tragic day, but a lot has changed in Ukraine as well. And unfortunately, since that time, part of your territory is occupied. The illegal annexation of Crimea is an ongoing issue that not only Latvia is concerned about, but the European Union and I think the world community. At the same time, you have an ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine. Here too, your territory is occupied. And while so much of Europe and the world is preoccupied with the scourge of terrorism, in our view, what is happening in eastern Ukraine is also a product of terrorism. What we have tried to do in Latvia is maintain the European Union's focus on the crisis that is taking place between Ukraine and Russia. During our 6-month presidency of the European Union, we did everything to continue to keep the European Union's focus on the Eastern Partnership and specifically the situation in Ukraine. Also, as NATO members, we have continued to try to maintain attention to this issue. And while, as I said today, Europe has other crises to deal with, the situation in Northern Africa, the refugee crisis, the terrorism crisis, for us, we think it's very important to keep the focus also on the situation here in Ukraine. You face many challenges, internally as well as externally. We know that you are trying to deal with reforms. You are moving ever closer to the European Union. Your military is moving ever closer to reaching NATO standards. This will all take time. But yesterday we had some very important and valuable meetings with members of your parliament, also with NGOs. And while the progress is slow and while there is a challenge still ahead, we heard some very encouraging news. And I think probably the most positive news, and this is something that I personally value very highly since along with our ambassador, Argit Daudz, I was in Maidan on February 20th and I saw what took place there, is to realize that Maidan is something that is continuing but in a different way. And what we've learned is that your civil society now is no longer just in the streets, but it is actually working to try to help the government, to try to help the politicians to actually make long-term sustainable change in Ukraine. And we in Latvia will do everything we can politically, and with our limited resources, we hope to continue our economic cooperation, cultural cooperation. We have a sizable Ukrainian community in Latvia. We have a Ukrainian school there. We are very proud of this community. They are very loyal citizens of Latvia, and again, the information that we've acquired today and yesterday will be very valuable for us to take back to our parliament, to our government, and to the rest of Europe and to the Transatlantic Alliance. So I just, on behalf of our committee, just want to again wish well to all the people of Ukraine and keep up the good work, because it may take time. And even in a case like Crimea, I think here you need to remember the situation of the Baltic states. We were illegally occupied for 50 years, and many thought that we never had a chance for independence. But like we said, never say never. It may take time, and hopefully your situation will be resolved much quicker. But the important thing is for society to be united, to work toward the same goals, and to work with your friends and your allies in Europe and across the ocean, and we will do everything in our power to help you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kalniņš. And if I may, I would just first start with a question. What is, if there is a specific sphere that Latvia supports a lot in Ukraine, what is it? Sphere of reforms, I mean.
Well, I know that we had a very interesting meeting yesterday at Mihailovsky Cathedral and learned that we are working a great deal to establish your chaplain program in the military. And we learned that we apparently have helped a great deal because of the traumas that are suffered by soldiers, the psychological difficulties on the front, and apparently the chaplain program is becoming very well established here. We have also worked in other areas, especially in terms of education, I think also in cultural support. Through our cooperative development programs, we've also sent NGOs here, so we're a small country, less than 2 million people, but we have certain niche capabilities. And also we had a very interesting meeting with one of our people who works in the EDSO, or OSCE mission, also, where we learned a great deal about what OSCE is trying to do to monitor the situation in the East.
Thank you very much, and we have the next question.
Богдана Костюк, Radio Liberty. My question,
Dana Kostyuk, Radio Liberty.
as well as Estonia and many other countries, are under press and under influence of Russian propaganda. You have a very good experience how to make counter-propaganda. Did you talk about it? Thank you.
Well, first of all, the whole concept of information warfare, which is part of hybrid warfare, is one of the key issues that we have to deal with today. And I'm very proud of the fact that Latvia was the country in NATO that established an excellence center for strategic communications. It is now fully functioning. Now, the goal of the center is not to create counter-propaganda, but it's to understand and analyze the propaganda that is being distributed, not only by Moscow, but also by Daesh. Both of these forces are using not only the traditional media but social media to distribute both propaganda and to confuse and to mislead people. And so our Excellence Center is trying to analyze this to provide information to governments and to organizations so they can deal with it. At the same time, during our presidency of the European Union, we also helped establish, along with the High Representative Federica Mogherini, a new task force on strategic communication. Because if we look at what NATO is doing, usually you consider that military information. But political disinformation is equally damaging. And here I think it's important for the European Union to recognize this. Because the campaign is not just to mislead us about what's happening in the occupied territories of eastern Ukraine or Crimea, but it's also political. For example, one of the most important issues right now between the European Union and the United States is the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. But we see that an awful lot of propaganda in Europe is being spread to basically derail this agreement. We also see that a lot of propaganda is being used to sow disunity within the European Union, to promote Euroscepticism. This needs to be exposed so that on the one hand, yes, we need to produce more Russian language information that is honest, that is straightforward. At the same time, we need to educate the people in the West, in Europe, in the United States, and Canada, on the information that they receive, whether it's RT or Sputnik or other sources. Something that I've said a lot in the last year is that you cannot ban lies, but you can defeat them. And you could do that by providing better information. We cannot enter a new stage of censorship, but what we have to do is help our people understand what these lies are, where they're coming from, and provide them with better, more reliable information so they can react appropriately. And this is where Latvia is trying to take the lead, and we would like to see maybe the European Union do more in terms of helping Ukraine, helping many in this region develop better media information that can go to all the people in the region. And hopefully we will be able to move something in that direction.
Thank you very much. I see there are no questions for now, so I would continue with my questions if you don't mind. You said that the Baltics were not independent for over 50 years, and now you see the situation with Crimea is getting a bit more intense with recent developments. I don't know if you're aware, but they blew up the energy supply pillars. Do you think this is the right way to return the occupied territories?
I don't think that's what's going to return the occupied Crimea. That is, ultimately it will have to be a diplomatic political solution. I think the important thing here is that for the European Union, for the transatlantic countries, for the global community, to maintain a solid, unified position, not to recognize the illegal incorporation of territory. I think this has to be a universal principle. I think even countries like China understand that this is not to be tolerated anywhere in the world. So I think, first of all, no matter how long it takes, we cannot recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea. At the same time, as you know, the European Union has a two-track policy concerning sanctions. Now, Latvia supports the continuation of sanctions against Russia, not as an end in itself, but as a means to stop the conflict in eastern Ukraine. The first priority with sanctions is to end the conflict, to stop the killing that's going on. Once that has been resolved, the next phase will be to try to resolve the situation in Crimea. And my understanding is more and more the people in the Donbas region in Crimea are realizing that this is not a solution for them. They are very unhappy with what's happening. But I don't think any of these situations can be resolved through force, through violence. And hopefully we will be able to resolve this issue in the long term, because the number one concern is for the people who live there. You do not want to make people suffer because of the acts of terrorists or crooked politicians.
Thank you very much. And I will have one more question for myself. Are there no more? Okay, we have one more question, please.
Yeah, it's Maria, Ukraine Crisis Media Center. I'd like to wonder, well, here from Ukraine, it seems like the world's attention shifted to the Middle East after events in Syria and Russian participation there. Is it really so? Do European politicians still remember of our ongoing conflict, or their attention is really there? Thank you.
I think politicians do remember, but they also need to be reminded. Unfortunately, as you know, with the media, every day attention gets shifted to a new crisis. And we see that around the world. Last year, the focus was on Crimea, on eastern Ukraine. Then suddenly, as the Daesh emerged in northern Africa, the focus was on that. This year, it's now the refugee crisis. But organizations like the European Union cannot afford to step aside and just look at one. We have to deal with everything. I think that's part of Latvia's goal, and I would include our neighbors, Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland in this, is that we have to use our contacts in the European Union and in NATO to remind countries that are further away that this still is an unresolved issue and it can affect them. And I think one example of that was last year, the tragic downing of the Malaysian airline flight. because that brought home to many people in the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe that a conflict that takes place here could affect them and their loved ones. The same thing is true with terrorism, and I think in all of the interparliamentary bodies that we participate in, we try to bring this message home. And like I said, during our EU presidency, we stressed that Europe has several neighborhoods. It has the eastern neighborhood, yes, it has a southern neighborhood, and sooner or later we're going to have to deal with the northern neighborhood, which is the Arctic. And that too could become a zone of conflict because of resources. So we have to remind people that all of these issues are real because everywhere real people are suffering. And we will continue to do so. And I would say that at least at a government level, foreign ministry level, the politicians understand that. Sometimes it's harder to get the public at large to focus on more than one issue because they don't follow these political issues. But that's our job as politicians and diplomats.
Thank you. If there are any other questions, then one final question from me. In the light of Russian propaganda and everything, and having so many ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking citizens in Latvia, do you think there is a risk of having a similar unstable situation in some regions of Latvia, like it happened with Ukraine?
No. First of all, Latvia has never had ethnic conflicts. If there are differences, they are political differences, but they have very little to do with ethnicity. And I think there's no reason to believe that the Russian-speaking people or the ethnic Russian people of Latvia are a threat. They are citizens of Latvia. They pay taxes. They live in the European Union. They see the advantages of being part of the Eurozone, of being able to travel freely through Europe. And that's not a real threat. The threat is always from provocateurs, but they could be of any nationality. They are political. They have a different agenda. But I don't see that as a threat in Latvia, because I think most of our citizens are very loyal citizens of Latvia. Even the mayor of Riga is of ethnic Russian background, and I don't think this is a real issue for Latvia.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your support from Latvia, and thank you for coming today and speaking to us. We will finish our press conference here. Дуже дякую, шановні колеги. На цьому будемо завершувати прес-брифінг. Наша наступна зустріч з вами у прес-залі об 11:00.